By the end of the Beatles, George Harrison no longer argued about who wrote what. He didn't need to. Years of tension, ignored songs, and creative frustration had taught him one thing clearly. Genius reveals itself, whether you like it or not. And when George spoke about Paul McCartney's best work, his praise was never casual. He didn't flatter, he didn't exaggerate. If George said a Paul song proved something, it meant it survived scrutiny. Musical, emotional, and human. These are the songs where George Harrison heard beyond the politics of the band. Songs where craftsmanship, melody, and emotional control showed Paul McCartney operating at his highest level. This is not about chart success. This is about moments where even George, often the most skeptical Beatle, recognized real genius. Number 10, The Long and Winding Road, not 1970.
The long and winding road.
When Paul McCartney brought The Long and Winding Road into the Beatles sessions, the band was already fractured. Tempers were short. Trust was thin, and George Harrison in particular was tired of sentimentality being mistaken for substance. But this song was different. At its core, it was brutally simple. A slow, unresolved melody built on restraint rather than drama. Paul wrote it during the get-back period, sitting alone at the piano, channeling exhaustion, distance, and quiet resignation. There was no ambition to impress, and only an attempt to articulate loss without bitterness.
It always leads me.
George later acknowledged that this was where Paul's strength truly lived. Not in polish, not in charm, but in emotional control. What impressed George was how the song resisted overstatement. The melody circles rather than explodes. The lyrics never accuse, they simply endure. It felt less like a pop composition and more like a confession delivered carefully, because saying too much would break it. Ironically, George disliked the orchestral overdubs added later, but never the song itself. In private conversations, he separated production mistakes from compositional truth. To George Harrison, The Long and Winding Road proved that Paul McCartney didn't need complexity to show genius. He only needed honesty, and the discipline to leave silence intact. Number 9, Every Little Thing, 1964.
Beside her, people tell me I'm lucky.
At first glance, Every Little Thing sounded like a minor Beatles track. Short, upbeat, almost disposable. But George Harrison never judged Paul McCartney's work by surface charm. What caught George's attention wasn't the hook, it was the architecture. Paul wrote the song during a transitional period in 1964 when the Beatles were moving from stage-first performers to studio-minded writers. The melody looks simple, but its internal balance is precise. Verse and chorus mirror each other emotionally, creating a feeling of reassurance rather than excitement.
I was lonely without her.
George later noted how Paul instinctively understood function in songwriting. This wasn't a song trying to stand out. It was a song designed to support an album's emotional flow. That restraint impressed him. Ironically, George himself played timpani on the track, an unusual choice for a pop song at the time. It wasn't done for experimentation, but because Paul heard weight where others heard lightness. That contrast stuck with George. To him, Every Little Thing proved that Paul's genius wasn't always loud. It lived in decisions no one noticed. Arrangement choices, harmonic stability, emotional economy. George once implied that only a composer confident in his instincts would write something this modest and make it work. That kind of control, he believed, separated real craftsmen from hitmakers. Number 8, Here, There, and Everywhere, in 1966.
Lead a better life. I need my love to be here.
George Harrison always said there were Paul McCartney songs that looked simple on paper but collapsed the moment you tried to take them apart. Here, There, and Everywhere was one of them. The song was written during the Revolver sessions, a period when the Beatles were under constant pressure to outgrow themselves. Paul arrived with what sounded like a gentle love song, almost fragile. But as the band worked through it, George quickly realized how deceptive it was.
Yeah, making
The harmony moved with absolute precision, Every vocal line was placed deliberately, every chord change resolving tension before the listener even noticed it existed. George later said it was one of those songs where nothing could be improved. Not a lyric, not a note, not a pause. What impressed him most was the discipline behind it. Paul didn't overload the arrangement. There were no studio tricks, no psychedelic disguises, just melody, harmony, and restraint. That restraint, George believed, required far more confidence than experimentation. During recording, George watched Paul guide the vocals with near mathematical accuracy. He wasn't dominating, he was shaping. To George, this was proof that Paul's genius wasn't about ego. It was about control. He once implied that songs like this were why Paul didn't need to shout about his talent. The music already knew. Number 7, Let It Be, 1970.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary.
By the time Let It Be was taking shape, the Beatles were barely functioning as a band. Tension filled the room, conversations were short, trust was thin, and yet, in the middle of that collapse, Paul McCartney arrived with a song that felt almost impossibly calm. George Harrison was skeptical at first, not of the melody, but of the moment. The band was breaking apart. Lawsuits loomed. Nothing felt resolved. And yet, Paul was writing a song about acceptance. But as rehearsals dragged on during the Get Back sessions, George began to understand what Paul was doing. Let It Be wasn't denial.
Speaking words of wisdom, let it be.
It was defiance through grace. The structure was classic, almost hymnal. Chord changes that felt inevitable. A melody that didn't chase emotion but carried it. George later acknowledged that this kind of songwriting required courage. Not innovation, but conviction. What struck him most was Paul's refusal to complicate the song. No psychedelic layers, no clever tricks, just piano, voice, and space. During recording, George added his guitar part carefully, never intruding on the song's core. He knew this wasn't a track to fight over. It needed clarity, not argument. In private reflections, George admitted that Let It Be proved something crucial about Paul. Even when everything was falling apart, Paul could still write music that held people together. Number 6, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, 1969. George Harrison saw She Came In Through the Bathroom Window as one of Paul McCartney's most instinctively brilliant moments. Not because it was ambitious, but because it was effortless. The song was born during the chaotic Abbey Road sessions, at a time when the band barely communicated off tape. Paul arrived with the song already fully formed, melody, rhythm, phrasing, as if it had simply fallen into place. There were no long debates, no endless revisions, it just worked. What caught George's attention was how visual the song was. Paul wasn't writing in abstractions. He was reacting to a real incident. Fans breaking into his house through a bathroom window. Instead of anger or bitterness, Paul turned the event into something playful, melodic, and oddly warm. In the studio, the track came together quickly. George appreciated that. The guitars were tight but never flashy. The rhythm section locked in naturally. There was no sense of anyone trying to prove a point, just musicians following the flow. Harrison later admired how Paul could transform chaos into charm. To him, this song proved something essential about McCartney's genius. He could take intrusion, tension, and exhaustion and turn them into joy. Number 5, Eleanor Rigby, 1966.
Look at all the lonely people.
George Harrison always believed Eleanor Rigby was the moment Paul McCartney proved he wasn't just writing pop songs. He was writing human stories. The song entered the Revolver sessions in an almost unfinished form. Paul arrived with fragments, a lonely woman, a church, a sense of quiet despair. There was no chorus in the traditional sense, no romantic resolution, and no obvious place for a guitar band to exist. For George, that was exactly what made it dangerous and brilliant. What stunned Harrison was Paul's confidence. He wasn't asking whether the song should be a Beatles track. He was asking how far they could push it. When George Martin proposed a string octet, George Harrison knew they were crossing a line no other rock band had even approached. During recording, Harrison barely played. That absence mattered. The band stepped aside to let the song breathe. Paul stood alone with his vocal, surrounded by sharp, unforgiving strings. George admired that restraint, knowing when not to play was its own form of musicianship. To Harrison, Eleanor Rigby proved Paul's genius lay in empathy. He wasn't writing about himself. He was writing about people no one noticed. And once again, the studio didn't shape Paul's vision. Paul reshaped what the studio could be. Number 4, Golden Slumbers, 1969.
Once there was a way.
George Harrison often saw Golden Slumbers as proof that Paul McCartney could turn the most fragile idea into something monumental. The song didn't begin as a Beatles composition at all. Paul discovered the lyrics in a 17th century poem by Thomas Dekker, found in a random book of old verse. He couldn't read the original melody, so he did what Paul always did. He trusted instinct and wrote a new one from scratch.
Sleep, pretty darling, do not cry.
What impressed George was how quietly the song entered the Abbey Road sessions. It wasn't presented as a single, not even as a full song. It was introduced as part of something larger. A thread in the medley Paul was obsessively shaping to give the album emotional closure. Harrison noticed that Paul wasn't chasing hooks anymore. He was building architecture. In the studio, Golden Slumbers became a study in control. The piano part was simple, almost childlike. The power came later, when the orchestration rose, when Paul's voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion and comfort at the same time. George admired how Paul allowed vulnerability to lead the arrangement instead of hiding it behind polish. To Harrison, Golden Slumbers proved Paul's genius wasn't just melodic, it was narrative. He knew exactly where a song sat in the emotional journey and how to make it land. This wasn't Paul writing for the charts, it was Paul writing a goodbye. Number 3, Blackbird, Sutter, 1968.
Singing in the dead of night. Take these.
George Harrison had a deep respect for Blackbird because he understood how deceptively difficult it was. On the surface, it sounded simple. One voice, one acoustic guitar, no studio tricks. But George knew better. He recognized the guitar part immediately. This wasn't folk strumming. It was a classical style piece, inspired by Bach, built around counter melodies played simultaneously with the vocal line. Paul didn't just write a song, he engineered a performance, and that impressed George. During the White Album sessions, Blackbird stood apart from the chaos. While the band was fragmenting into separate rooms and separate visions, Paul recorded the song almost alone, tapping his foot for rhythm, letting silence do half the work. George later acknowledged that this kind of confidence was rare, to strip everything back and still hold attention.
Blackbird singing in the dead of.
What mattered most to Harrison, though, was the intent. Paul explained that Blackbird was written in response to the civil rights movement in America. It wasn't a protest song in the usual sense. It was quiet, personal, hopeful without slogans. George admired that restraint. He believed Paul understood that subtlety could sometimes say more than anger. To Harrison, Blackbird proved Paul's genius wasn't loud or dominating. It was precise. It trusted the listener. And in a band known for reinvention, Blackbird showed that sometimes evolution meant knowing when to stop adding and start listening. Number 2, Hey Jude, 1968.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad.
George Harrison's respect for Hey Jude came with complexity because he had lived inside its creation, tension and all. He knew better than anyone that this song didn't emerge from harmony. It emerged from control, insistence, and Paul's absolute certainty that he was right. During the sessions, George famously tried to add a delicate guitar counter melody, only to be shut down by Paul. That moment became symbolic of the band's fractures. And yet, despite the frustration, George never denied the truth. Hey Jude worked. What What impressed Harrison was not the length, the famous sing-along, or its commercial success. It was Paul's nerve. No one in 1968 was releasing a 7-minute single that took 4 minutes just to explode. Paul trusted patience, he trusted emotional buildup, and George recognized how risky that was. The song's origin mattered too. Written to comfort Julian Lennon during his parents' divorce, Hey Jude carried a sincerity George couldn't ignore. It wasn't clever wordplay or studio experimentation, it was emotional architecture. A simple message expanded into something communal. George later acknowledged that while Hey Jude strained relationships, it also proved something undeniable. Paul understood mass emotion instinctively. He knew how to turn a private moment into a shared one. For Harrison, Hey Jude wasn't perfect, but it was fearless. And that fearlessness, even when it hurt, was part of Paul McCartney's genius. Number 1, Yesterday, 1965.
Yesterday, all my...
For George Harrison, Yesterday was the moment Paul McCartney crossed an invisible line, from band songwriter to something much rarer. Not just talented, not just prolific, but inevitable. The song arrived almost fully formed, famously appearing to Paul in a dream. To George, that alone was unsettling. Most Beatles songs were fought over, reshaped in the studio, pulled apart by arrangement and ego. Yesterday didn't need any of that. It simply existed. During the recording, George watched Paul stand alone. Literally, no band performance, no shared spotlight, just McCartney, an acoustic guitar, and later a string quartet arranged by George Martin. Harrison didn't resent that decision. He understood it. The song didn't need the Beatles. That was the point. What struck George most was the restraint. Paul didn't overwork it. He didn't decorate it. He trusted silence, space, and vulnerability. In a band obsessed with momentum and innovation, Yesterday dared to stop moving. Harrison later acknowledged that this was a different kind of genius, not experimental like Lennon, not spiritual like his own later work, but timeless. Yesterday sounded like it had always existed, as if Paul had simply discovered it rather than written it. For George, that was the ultimate proof. When a song feels older than its creator, you're not witnessing craft anymore. You're witnessing something permanent. Yesterday wasn't just Paul McCartney's masterpiece. It was the moment George Harrison knew Paul's genius couldn't be argued with, only accepted.